Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Oh, no. I never let anybody read my stories.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're back in the saddle. It's been like a month since we recorded and had a guest. I've been traveling and holidaying and having summer. What have you been up to, Chad?
Oh, I've been having tons of fun. I had on July 12th foot surgery, and the joint in my right big toe was like 70% gone, basically. So they opened me up and fused the bone together. And dude, I got to be honest with you, I had no idea what I was getting into. None. The recovery has been long, tedious. Mentally, it's been very difficult because I have to do a lot of sitting, which I'm not used to. And so that's been difficult. And then, of course, the long period of time on the painkillers is always, everybody's like, oh, that's the best part. I particularly did not enjoy that. Right. If you are listening and you are ever thinking about getting foot surgery, please make sure that you sit down with your podiatrist or surgeon and make sure that you know exactly what you're getting into.
Dude, I'm sorry to hear that. That's painful and annoying.
I'm sorry. I just forgot.
For those who are listening, we've got a guest today. Our guest is Benjamin Shaw. He's a distinguished Christian apologist, scholar, and author of the book we're going to be kind of chatting about a bit here, called Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. And so he's got a passion for defending the Christian faith. He's dedicated years to studying the historical and textual foundations of the New Testament. And this book offers a robust and accessible approach to understanding why believers can confidently trust the New Testament as a reliable account of Jesus' life and teachings. So we've talked about gospel reliability on the podcast before with other guests. We might link in the show notes if you're lucky. But this one goes for the whole New Testament, and it's a really unique book in that way. If you've kind of said, hey, you could pick a handful of books over the last 10 to 15 years and sort of cobble together, hey, read this about the canon, here, read this about the Gospels, here, read this about maybe the minimal facts approach, read this about undesigned coincidences, read this about, the number of manuscripts, read this about making a cumulative case. Or you could say, well, just take this book and it rolls together all the best stuff. It's like, your trail mix. You got a little bit of everything in there for a highly nutritious snack, leading you down the path of truth. So,
well, I wanted to say about the book, if I may, that what was interesting for me is unbeknownst to myself, he refers in the book a lot to Bart Ehrman's book, Does Jesus Exist? Which is, of course, the book that Bart Ehrman wrote responding to Jesus mythicism. Well, I literally, during my recovery, read that book. Yeah. And so I read the book back to back. So it was really interesting to read Bart's book, which in many ways is very good. I have a lot of disagreements with Bart, obviously, when it comes to, I'm sick calling him Bart like I know him. Dr. Ehrman, when it comes to the historical Jesus, I think that he is selectively skeptical in a lot of ways. But the book was actually quite good, and it was neat to see how Ben Shaw interacts with it directly after reading it. And I will say that having that luxury of reading Dr. Ehrman's book and then reading Shaw's right after it, he did a good job representing Ehrman fairly and honorably. So that gave me a lot more confidence in some of the other quotes and things that he shared. And the other thing is, and I mentioned this to you already off podcast, the footnotes, man. I don't know how many books I starred that I was like, oh, I got to get that one. I'm going to have to read that. I'm going to have to read that. And then by the end of the book, I thought I could literally probably just read these books and I probably wouldn't get them all done by the time I was dead, unless all I had to do was read. So
yeah, if you hadn't read anything about, the reliability of the New Testament, or is it trustworthy, and you struggle with that question, and you started here with this book, and it would give you all the bunny trails that you could ever dream for to find, oh, okay, well, I want to know more about this. Well, here's a handful of books that he points to, and then, all the usual sources, We're going to go right to this interview. Looking forward to talking to Benjamin Shaw here about his book, Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. Let's go right to it.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Ben Shaw, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. We've enjoyed your book. We'll talk about it a bit, but tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start with our opening question after that.
Yeah, so, a lot of different places to begin. I'll just start with, I got saved at a young age. My babysitter took me to church, and I heard the Sermon on the Mount at Sunday school, and I just recognized Jesus as Lord then. Made a public profession a couple years later. Wasn't really discipled, though, throughout those years. God had areas where he definitely encouraged me and strengthened me along the way. But I had a lot of questions. I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, so a lot of different views down there on different things. And so I started wondering, what about their view? What about their view? What about this? What about my view? And no one seemed to have good answers on anything. Everyone was just doing their own views. And so I started playing ice hockey. Figured that'd be the wisest move to do. I wanted to meet a girl. And
Chad loves ice hockey.
Indeed. I was excited when I read that in the book.
Well, I thought that was what the cool guys did. And I wanted, I didn't know what I was doing, but I wanted to do what they were doing. I didn't care much for school at the time. Long story, I ended up going to Connecticut for 3 years to play hockey and did that. Realized it was cold up there, so I came back to Florida. If I wasn't going to have an ice rink on campus to play at, I played for Florida Atlantic University for a year. And then during the summer, after my first year there, one of the guys who I knew from church, because once I could drive, I started to go. He was like, why don't you go to Liberty? You can learn about God at Liberty and ask questions and things like that. I'm like, wow, I can do that down here in Florida where we got warmth and, we don't have 4 seasons. We have 1. It's green and warm all the time. And he goes, okay, I just thought you might like it. I'm like, yeah, I can learn about God on Monday. Start Monday. And then he was a couple weeks later, he's like, hey, they got an ice rink on campus. And I'm like, dude, why didn't you start with that? That's like, how many hockey friends do you have? And so then I saw a picture of the ice rink, and it was amazing. It just had been built, actually, in January that year. They were using it for the hockey team at Liberty. And I applied and got in but 2 weeks before school started, and then made the team. Eventually became one of the captains my last year. And then during that process, I got to ask a lot of questions about God. I met the former hockey coach, who was Gary Habermas. I don't know if you guys have heard of him.
Yes.
He's done stuff outside of hockey, but he's kind of got a name in the hockey industry here. But on our road trips, I started listening to podcasts and guys doing question and answers at universities and things like that. I'm like, oh my goodness, those are the same questions I have. And so like one of them is, I didn't realize, I didn't know who wrote Romans or 1 Corinthians. I didn't know who those guys were. I didn't know who the authors were or how the Bible came together and just those general questions. And I learned Paul wrote half the New Testament when I came to Liberty. I was like, oh, he was the persecutor of the church. It's kind of a big deal. So I wanted to start learning more and more. I was a marketing major because I wanted to be law enforcement and I wanted to help people, but I didn't know how to do that because people have really big problems. And only God can really help a lot of the problems that a lot of people have. So I wanted to learn more about God. Since I'm from South Florida, I ended up, so I got my marketing degree, and then I did a Master Arts in Religious Studies because that allowed me to continue to ask questions and also look at other worldviews because I'm from South Florida and there's just different worldviews. So what's the difference? What are the evidential considerations and things like that? And then I still had questions and got given an opportunity to study as Dr. Habermas's research assistant while going and getting a PhD. So I was like, oh, that's amazing. Let's do that. So then I ended up working with him since like 2012 or 11 maybe. I did my master's thesis on the minimal facts, and he kind of sat in on that. So that was where we kind of first started plugging away together a little bit. And then after my first year in the PhD program, I was one person's research assistant, and then I switched to his. And then we just started doing a bunch of work. And then he started his MO in that process too. So we've been doing a lot of work since then. And so that's kind of my background. Also, since then, I graduated in 2020. I took a good long time to do school. And I've got a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and that's a lot of fun.
Wow.
Yeah, so still do that.
So watch out! Don't get in a fight on a hockey rink with you.
Jiu-jitsu with ice skates, that could be really bad. That could be really bad. That could be messy.
I did use jiu-jitsu I wasn't, at my heaviest, I was 175 in ice hockey. But there was one time, this was back at FA, when I was playing for FAU, and it was at the end of my shift, and a scuffle happened. And I was at the end of the shift, so I was already really tired. So I threw what I could, and then I just grabbed the guy and I did a takedown, and we just, refs, get in here, break this thing up. And,
nice.
And then we went to our benches.
Yeah, so you mentioned being Gary Habermas's research assistant. Of course, listeners will know him as one of the foremost experts in the world on the evidence for the resurrection. And is there any lessons that you learned from him? One or two things that you could share?
One, we want to stick to the evidence. Two, keep the main thing the main thing. And the resurrection's the main thing. So staying there, we're very similar in a lot of ways, and we're different in a lot of ways too. We're both very easygoing on a lot of things, except when it comes to those core things. We want to make sure we have those things really well down pat. So that's some of the stuff. Of course, my interest in the resurrection, near-death experiences, those have all grown. And but then also too, how to do research. So this is a good tip or trick for guys. This is part of the way he does research, and he's taught us, is when you're doing research. Say I've got a book here, Jewish Scholarship on Jesus' Resurrection. So he's going to be talking about things like empty tomb, burial. But at the beginning of the book, so say I go through and there's a good section on Jesus' burial. I write burial at the beginning of the book, and then I put, every time I come across the relevant page numbers, I can track them down. And so now when I go back to the book, I don't have to go, oh, where did he talk about burial? I already have my own index at the front of the book to go find out where it is. Yeah, so that's been a helpful tool because, we got the Olympics going on, and I use this analogy a lot because Habermas, the same way, so we're built differently. Habermas has a great mind for academics and a great memory and an ability to recall that's phenomenal. And he's built for it. The same way Michael Phelps is built for the water, his brain is built for data. My brain is not. But I'm usually pretty quick on a computer. I can find information almost as fast as he can recall it. So I try to use those skills. But those are the neat things, seeing him, and you're seeing different levels, because there's PhDs the same way as there's black belts, but not all black belts are the same. Not all PhDs are the same. And so there's a reason he's where he's at, and the things he's done is just God's gifted him that way. And so I don't want to try to be Habermas 2.0 because God didn't make me like that. God made me Ben Shaw, so I got to use the skills and talents he's given me with the opportunities that he gave me as far as studying goes. And actually, one of the things that we're trying to do right now with that is we recently started a ministry in October, November of last year called Core Apologetics, where we're trying to carry on the work he's done, but instead of it just staying in universities, because right now, if you want to study with Habermas, all you got to do is apply to the PhD program at Liberty, get accepted, schedule your week, and fly here and take the classes.
That's all.
Most people, no big deal. But so what we want to do is we want to help get more people access to his information, especially churches, so they can major on the majors. And so if you have, your church leaders, new believers getting grounded in the minimal facts and those sorts of things, I think, and we think that's just very powerful. But we also don't want it to just sit in our minds. It should, like Ephesians 2:10, should lead to the doing of good works that God's prepared beforehand for us to walk in. So those are some of the things we're doing. What's kind of cool about it, and I know we're going to talk about it here, is I'll just share two things because it'll be a good segue. We do a class, an online class on Jesus' resurrection. You guys are probably not a surprise there. But what we do is we teach it live, where I'm teaching it. So people can ask questions. So if you're going through the case for the resurrection yourself, And you're like, oh, do I have this right? Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested. Yeah, like we can go through those and ask those questions. We're also going to be doing one on my book coming up soon because New Testament reliability is important. So it's just 6 weeks. It's online. We talk, we engage in those things, but it's helpful because you're getting kind of some back and forth and fellowship on these important topics. And then the goal with reliability is that you'll then go read your Bible more and apply it more. So that's where I struggled because I didn't understand the Bible coming to Liberty. And when I learned more about it and how to read it, it was immensely important in my maturity as a believer.
That's good.
This book is really cool because it covers so many different angles and facets of New Testament reliability. I was telling Chad, it's sort of like, you could if someone wanted to learn about New Testament reliability, you could suggest to them about a dozen different books, which all cover these different strands, or you could say, or you could read this book, which sort of brings together all the best stuff, and a great starting point as well, just for anybody interested in the topic. So with all that, it's like, where to begin? So for my mind, I'm thinking, I wonder what Ben Shaw would say if someone came up and why should I believe that the New Testament is reliable? You have a very short time to do that. What's the sort of thumbnail sketch you're going to lay out there?
I'm assuming I'm not allowed to say the minimal facts. That would not be allowed. But that's usually my go-to. Because that lets you not only talk about reliability, but hone in on the gospel too. So you're getting to do double duty there. I typically like historical criteria because it's something intuitive that we do every day as it is. And so I like those. I think that's pretty interesting. And the creeds and criteria are probably the two I think that are effective, just because the criteria are things like I just mentioned them actually. Jesus' death, for example, is multiply attested. So when we've got multiple reports coming out that are attesting to, some event, well, that's good. The Titanic going down, for example, that's one Maconie uses. Those are multiple reports, each of which add weight to the historicity of an event. Now, it's not saying like a retweet counts because that's not another witness. There's someone else copying someone else. So I like the criteria. You got other things like embarrassing testimony. I can use a car accident example. So like if I was driving and I wasn't paying attention and I bumped into somebody in front of me, the cops came and asked my wife what happened. She's like, yeah, my husband, he was not paying attention. That's embarrassing testimony because she's working against her self-interests there. So I like those. I think they're pretty interesting, and it allows someone to intuitively look at the New Testament based off how we already look at the past.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm just putting myself thinking, oh, well, I know a certain person who might listen to this podcast, and I'm thinking, okay, how are they going to respond to what you just said? One thing that comes to mind is like, oh, minimal facts. Okay, to explain that, that's you would prefer to argue for the resurrection first. As you said, you're like Habermas in the sense of keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is, did Jesus rise from the dead? So the minimal facts approach is take a few really well-attested historical facts that scholars tend to agree upon and argue from that, making a case for Jesus really rose from the dead. That's the main thing. Now, if you were going for New Testament reliability as a whole, one of the things you mentioned there was historical criteria. So that's eyewitness testimony, multiple attestation, different ways that we can verify the accuracy of accounts. So unpack a few of those things. You said that's one of the first things you go to. So let's just go down that path and talk about how do we know what criteria do historians use to say, hey, this is reliable and this isn't?
Yeah, sometimes. So I've got a background. When I was in school, I was also I had a full-time job as an insurance adjuster. And so, we'd come on car accidents and things like that. Hence that car accident example just a moment ago. If you're a detective and you come on a scene and you have to figure out what happened, you're going to look for, witnesses first. So that's your multiple attestation because you're trying to figure out who hit who. Was it the silver car or was it the red car? And so as you start having, 3, 4, 5 people saying it was the silver car that hit the red car, well, then that gives you good reason to believe it was the silver car that hit the red car. If we start seeing too that some of those people, some of those, say 7 witnesses, they start saying, yeah, look, my friend's the driver of the silver car too, and it was his fault. Now you're getting embarrassing testimony. So those, as we start adding different criteria, another one is enemy attestation. So if we have someone who has no reason to support anything we're doing, and yet they do. So for example, you may have someone who really doesn't like the red driver, like, oh, I can't stand that guy. But yeah, the silver guy, it was his fault. Okay, well, he is interested in pinning the blame on the red driver, but even he is saying it was the silver car's fault. So each of those add weight to the historicity of an event. Now, with that said, if it doesn't have those things, because there's a lot of events in history that are just attested to by one source, those things can still happen. But if we have these criteria, it adds historical weight to them having occurred. So that's one reason why I do like them. And they're kind of fun to talk about and see how they apply to these things. Again, like Jesus' death, you could look at other events. Jesus as a miracle worker is another one. And the criteria actually add a lot of weight to why a lot of scholars think Jesus was a miracle worker. It's attested to widely. Early sources is another one. Because, and you think about this, if someone disagrees with these, should I be using later sources? Do you want fewer sources? You want more biased sources? Okay, I got it. Of course, these are just normal, natural things. And so I think that's one of the takeaways too, is the same way it's what's good for the goose is good for the gander. How we treat, normal knowledge of the past, we want to do those sorts of things here. So I hope that kind of helps unpack the criteria a little bit. I use those, and then the minimal facts use those too. So there's some overlap there because I like to use them in relation to those core events to the resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the book's called Trustworthy, and then the subtitle is 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. When we say that the New Testament is trustworthy or reliable, first of all, are those two words synonymous? And then secondly, what does that actually mean? Does that mean it's inerrant? What are we talking about when we say it's reliable or trustworthy?
Yeah, those are good questions. The book is not talking, and it's not getting into the discussions of inerrancy, inspiration, or anything like that. It's just trustworthy and reliable. They're not quite synonymous, but they're close enough. We're starting at just the broadest level of what do we mean by reliable or trustworthy. So I could say, hey, is this chair reliable? Yeah, I'm sitting in it. It's working great. A reliable flotation device? No. Like if I'm drowning and you throw a chair at me, I'm thinking you're going to kill me. So, what is reliable and what is trustworthy they've got contexts to them. And so each chapter kind of shades an angle or a level to what we mean by reliability and trustworthy. For example, just knowing, because I use a map analogy a lot. So we want to zoom in, we want to zoom out. We want to know, is this map we're looking at of a real place or is it Narnia? Those different types of questions. So as we look at those different levels, we see, it's reliable at this level. It's reliable at this level, and so on and so on. So we do have it in a very broad term there. And again, the hope is that it will encourage people to, it's reliable at these different, let me read it more now that I understand it at these different levels. And then I can go engage it. And Lord willing, because Scripture is living and active, it will begin to interpret the reader as much as the reader seeks to interpret the text.
That's good. To piggyback on that, one of the things that you do in the book to show that the New Testament is reliable is you take a cumulative approach. Can you talk about the advantages of taking that type of approach?
Yeah, I think that that just comes in with the levels, because there's a lot of flexibility in language. And we mentioned hockey before, and someone could go, "Oh, Ben, you played college hockey. You must be good." And yeah. Oh, I was good. Oh, did you ever play with Alexander Ovechkin? He's good. Wait a minute. We're talking two different things here. So
right.
I think it's important to understand that we can use these words on different levels. And when we see all these levels coming together, we are seeing this multifaceted angle at which the New Testament is reliable on these different levels, and not just the rational level, but the heart level, the application level too. I try to address and touch on as well, because part of I didn't share this at the beginning, but I tried reading the Bible a number of times growing up. And, you start at Genesis because that's the beginning of the Bible. And then by Leviticus, you're like trying to figure out, oh man, this is hard. I'm not quite getting stuff. What's going on here? And so I'm hoping that one of the takeaways is now that you have a better overview, zoomed out and zoomed in view, it will encourage people to read scripture and then understand it and from those different angles and vantage points. Because since you guys are Apologetics 315, I could ask you this question: is knowing that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, is that an apologetic question or a discipleship question? It's just a
yes.
Well, yes.
Yes,
Exactly.
I was going to say, I could argue it's both. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So, and that's kind of the point. Like, I don't know how to package that. I just know it's important to know it.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
So if you're a doubter coming to it, well, that addresses you. If you need the apologetic element, well, that's going to address you. If you're a disciple who just has questions, because disciples should have questions, that's part of, when you're understanding the hope that you have, you've got to learn that hope. And in that process of learning, you're going to have questions. So the aim there is to help equip them as to why it's trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. How does understanding the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies, do you think, strengthen the case for the reliability? And what sort of evidence supports the traditional authorship?
Yeah, okay, so we got the genre and authorship questions there. So the genre question, this is why it's fun to have conversations, because I'm like very tempted, Brian, to ask you back, would it make a difference if the Gospels were romances or ancient novels as opposed to Greco-Roman biographies?
So are you saying, does it make a difference whether or not the Gospels are, say, ancient biography versus like a Nicholas Sparks novel? Is that what you're asking?
Not that kind of romance. Let me. Does it make a difference if you're watching a Star Wars movie or the news? Is there a difference in genre there? Right?
Sure.
You're understanding things dramatically different. So with biographies, now we know, okay, they're attempting the goal with which they're trying to write and which their readers expected them to write is one where they're not expected to just invent things whole cloth, invent new events and all sorts of things like that. That is not what is typically expected. Now, it's really cool development, the way that the Gospels have come to be understood as biographies. Now, they used to be understood for biography as ancient biographies for a long time. And then I think it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, there was some debate. Maybe the Gospels are just a unique genre. They're their own thing. And so scholars started, debating those issues. And then Richard Burridge kind of got into the discussion, I think in the 80s. And he was going to argue against the idea that the Gospels were biographies. And he started to write his dissertation on that. And then he came to find out, oh man, the Gospels are biographies. And he changed his mind, wrote a book called What Are the Gospels? And that work is now the definitive work on the fact that it's really convinced basically everybody that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. And so now we can come to that reading with that understanding. And that also helps us interpret the Gospels. But here's something really, I find it interesting, never talked about, or rarely never talked about except by Burridge. Because I think you asked the question this way: what does it mean to know that the Gospels are biographies? Well, this is a point that Burridge makes. There is no rabbinic biographies. There are stories about rabbis and and the way they teach people to follow the law, but there are no biographies in which a rabbi is pointed to as someone to emulate. Yet with the Gospels, Jesus is the person to emulate. So Burridge's point is they are saying something Christological about Jesus by their very genre, namely, he is the embodiment of the law and to follow him faithfully because here's his life and now we can model after it. So it's a pretty profound point. There's a lot of depth to it, but it's kind of one of those things where you're like, wow, I hadn't thought about that before. That is a really cool point to make. So anyway, that's on the genre. Does that feel?
Yeah, so that strengthens the case for its historical reliability, because we know that if their intention was to make a true historical account of an actual person who lived, and here's the actual things they did, and it fits this genre, then we know that we're not watching Star Wars, we're watching the news, for instance. So that was one part of the question. Further onto that, what about the authorship?
Right.
What is the importance of saying that these authors we would traditionally attribute to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? How does that help the case for New Testament reliability?
Yeah, let me back up a half a step.
Okay.
One of the other significant things about the Gospels as biographies is the proximity between the events and when they were written themselves, too. Because we have a number of biographies, like a number of Plutarch's biographies, they are like centuries before. So that emphasis on reporting things and trying to stay as honest and faithful to the facts as possible is all the more important when it's that close in time to the actual events. And that even when we use a number of different dates actually for the dating of the New Testament. But even if we use the latest ones that I present in the book, they're within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So they're all significant in that regards. So that adds to that genre issue. Those are kind of, they're mutually beneficial to one another. And then when it comes to the authorship, yeah, some scholars, and I used to think like this too, it doesn't necessarily, if say we didn't know who wrote those Gospels, I don't think I used to think this. I'm not quite as much on this path as I used to be, but it doesn't quite matter as much if we didn't know who they were, because we can still do the other historical methods, the historical criteria, for example, that I mentioned. We know that when they were written, even if we're not necessarily sure who. But that being said, the uniform testimony of the early church is that it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that wrote the Gospels. We don't have any competitors for those views. There's no challengers. Simon Gathercole, he's got a great article where he cites, I think, 10 different sources. I'm pretty sure it's double digits. It might be 12 different sources that all reference the gospel authors up to 200 AD. So he has a cutoff point. So this is basically within a century and change of the writings. And they're all attesting to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors. So that's like very significant in my opinion. If all the testimony is that those are the authors.
Yeah, one of the books you cite, sorry to interrupt, but one of the books you cite, by the way, your footnotes were just glorious. I don't know how many books. I told Brian I was just star. I got to get that. But one of the books you cite, and I'm not sure I'm going to say the author's name correctly, but The Case for Jesus by Brant Pitre.
Yes.
That I think he really makes that point strongly in that book, that we have no evidence to the contrary. All the evidence we have suggests that the original 4 authors were actually the authors of the Gospels. So I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought that was, backing up what you're saying. Yeah.
No, that's crucial. And that goes consistent with what Gathercole says. But one of the other points that Pitre points out,
alliteration is fun.
Yeah, Pitre's probable points is what he says here. So he also makes the point. It's a great point that if the Gospels. So I kind of combine Pitre, Gathercole, and Bauckham here, but the Gospels. We often hear the Gospels are anonymous, right? And so that's kind of probably why this question.
Bart Ehrman's probably the most famous proponent of that view. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd imagine Bart Ehrman has some anonymous books. I haven't thought to check this, and I say that because I think my book is technically anonymous. It doesn't. You guys, just saw it. Did it say anywhere I, Ben Shaw, authored this book? It doesn't say that in the writings themselves. Like Paul says, I, Paul, greet you, right? It doesn't say that in the book. It's on the cover though, so you can identify it that way.
Right.
Well, in the ancient world, they had the same thing. They would have different ways to identify works. With the author's name could be on a tab, for example, on the outside of the scroll. Because if you've got libraries of books, you've got to distinguish between the different books. And so those are some of the ways in which a book may be technically anonymous, but not functionally anonymous. The authors were expected to be known. And Luke, for example, he's writing to someone specifically, and I doubt Theophilus got this one day. I was like, oh, what a curious letter I just received. but it goes further than that, because one, there's, again, I like what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It's not the only, they're not the only technically anonymous works that we have. Lucian Samosata, he's got an anonymous work, which name's escaping me. Check the footnotes.
Yes.
I believe I put it in there. And then there's some others that have it. So it's not like it's a unique thing to the Gospels. It's just it's normal trade, so to speak. But let's ride the horse for a second and just see where it goes. So let's say they are anonymous, and we have these Gospels getting spread out throughout the Mediterranean. This is Pitri's point now, shifting from Balcom to Pitri. So we start shifting, and now you've got a copy of the Gospel of Mark, and say you've got one in Alexandria, say you've got one in Antioch, say you got one in Athens, and you got one in Rome. But they're all anonymous, right? They don't know it's Mark. Well, those guys are going to attribute a name to these Gospels. What are the odds that all 4 areas are going to come up with Mark as the author? Because he's so well known, right? Mark? No, he's not one of the disciples. So why are we going to invent him?
Right.
Or Luke, right? So that's an interesting argument against the functional anonymity. Sorry, it's late in the afternoon here. Of the Gospels. This is why I wrote a book and not did a lecture. So then not only do you need that with Mark, but then you need it with Matthew and Luke and John. So it's a fourfold problem. So I think that combined with all the references being the same, that being combined with the fact that we have other works, it's good to say those are the authors that stand behind the works. And then you can get into the technical stuff of if they used a secretary and what all that's going to look like and how that can shape or affect the writing of the gospel itself. That's beyond the scope of my book. So those questions are for the other guys.
Right. So a lot of times when I get into discussions with people about the reliability of the New Testament, one of the things they'll, and this will be kind of a twofold question, one of the things they'll want to go to immediately is the non-Christian sources. They somehow seem to think that these are more credible or more important. Why are the writings of the New Testament the best sources we have? Would be my first question. And then the second question would be, what can we learn from some of our non-Christian sources?
Good question. A lot of different jiu-jitsu moves you could put on it. I'm just trying to figure out which one. Just
put your hockey skates on.
Yeah.
Just take them one at a time. You got this.
Yeah. So no, it's because there's different levels at which you can answer that question. So it depends on the person who's asking it. So you could respond and say, well, look, here's some non-Christian sources, and here's what they say. You got Tacitus, you got Josephus, and they attest to Jesus being crucified under Pontius Pilate. Tacitus says that the Christians were checked for a moment, but then sprung back out in Judea. That's not insignificant. These aren't insignificant reports. I'll explain why in a minute. So you could just go and start unpacking the non-Christian sources and show, they're corroborating what we find in the New Testament. And that's good. That's helpful. That's very encouraging for believers. I mean, I remember even when I was reading them, it's encouraging to see those things, because again, it's not as though Christianity just happened inside of a bubble that didn't make any effect in the culture around it. And so that's helpful to see in how they viewed Christianity and things like that. So that's one element. Two, so the second angle is Bart Ehrman has a great argument. He goes, look, if you're going to use, if you're asking a historian to write on the American Revolution, what you're asking him to do, the equivalent would be, you're not allowed to use American sources for the American Revolution. George Washington, he's out of here. Terrible source. He's biased. If any professor of American history who did that would be, you'd think they would be fired. So that's just a ridiculous request. And again, I understand how it comes across if you've got a Christian saying it's a ridiculous request, but it's like, okay, look, here's also a skeptic saying it's a ridiculous request because, but every source is biased. The question is, as famously stated by Richard Evans and Carl Trueman, the question is, to what degree is that prejudice paramount or that bias paramount? And then that gets back into other issues. But nevertheless, we have there's bias in everything. So just because, George Washington is biased towards the Revolution, that doesn't make him a bad source for understanding the American Revolution. So that's one thing. Obviously, they're going to be invested, right? That's why they're involved in the first place. If they were disinterested, they're not going to write about it or talk about it or be involved in it. Yeah, if they're disinterested, they're not going to write about it. And coincidentally, that's the main reason that a lot of the non-Christian sources talk about Christianity, is because they had to, because it connected or touched upon what they were interested in talking about. So that's why they had to talk about it. So that's 2. Point 3, and I think I say this in the book because non-Christian sources are like chapter 10 or 11 or something like that. So hopefully the first 10 chapters or 9 chapters before that will show you why the New Testament sources are reliable apart from those non-Christian sources.
Yeah.
So, because there's good reasons independently for them to be considered reliable sources. So that's when I say it depends on the person who I'm talking to with which of those 3 types of responses, because there are 3 different directions, each of them. But I think they're each helpful, and they position and posture things nicely. And then I did mention I'd come back to this, that the sources like Tacitus and Josephus and others report Jesus' crucifixion. It's important that they say and corroborate what we find in the New Testament, as opposed to saying Jesus died as a revolutionary in the war in 66 to 70 AD in the revolution, right? So they don't say that he died in a revolution. They don't say he died in Greece. They say he died the same way that the Gospels and the New Testament describe him. So that's all important, because think if they did say those things, we'd be going, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? They must be speaking of a different Jesus or something. So, but they corroborate what we find. So that's significant, important, and again, just another layer and level. And so hopefully, again, I want to make sure I always emphasize this and continue to. Then the question for believers is, oh, wow, that's great, and that is encouraging. Now, I need to be more encouraged as I go out and live that out.
Well put. One of the some of the criteria you mentioned earlier when you were chatting with Brian about criteria that historians use to adjudicate whether or not a source is reliable. You mentioned multiple attestation. You mentioned embarrassing testimony, enemy attestation. But one of the ones you mentioned too were early sources. What kind of confidence can we have that? And I know you've spoken on this a bit already, but can you expound a bit on what kind of confidence we can have that the sources we have in the New Testament were early enough to the events, or close enough to the events would be a better way of putting it, that we don't have to be concerned that legend crept in?
Yeah, so they are early. They're within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, and that's if we use the late dates that Ehrman gives. So they can be late dating, and they're still within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So those are good sources, in my opinion, especially in antiquity. That's great. Those are great sources. Because we can have people today talking about World War II or other major life events that happened years ago and describe them. Now, part of the difference is these guys, the disciples, the apostles, they were not just saying them for the first time during the Gospels, for example. They were repeating it throughout those years and decades before the Gospels were written, depending on when you take they were written. So if Mark, like for example, some skeptical New Testament scholars think it's not just conservatives who date things early. Sometimes like skeptics do it and vice versa. So 2 skeptical historians have dated Mark to the 40s AD. So if that's accurate, the disciples were Mark and Peter. Peter was preaching for a decade before Mark wrote down this material. So it's not as though it's the first time they're hearing it. So those are all good dates. Paul's writings typically are considered to predate the Gospels. So if the Gospels are within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, Paul is a witness, and he's giving us material, writing to churches, and so that's good as well. That backs up even earlier. But we also talk about creeds. There's a whole chapter on the creeds, and that's sort of a combination of these criteria, because it is the earliest material we have. It's connected to eyewitnesses, and it's dated to the early 30s AD, almost universally. I can only think of a handful of people who would be an exception to that rule, and I'd have to go look them up because I think some of them are a bit dated. But creeds, so we're not talking about Nicaea, which was centuries later, but we're talking about oral traditions that were preserved in the New Testament texts themselves. And the oral traditions would be the ways in which formal teachings would be passed on. The rabbis would use this to pass on traditions very formally to make sure someone understood what was being taught and that they could repeat it and teach it themselves. So a catechesis of sorts. And so there are actually several different creeds in the New Testament that are preserved in writing. 1 Corinthians 15 is the most noticeable because Paul explicitly says, I delivered to you that which I received, and it uses the two Greek words, which are the technical words that rabbis would use for the passing off and the handing off of tradition. So Paul's telling us, hey, I'm getting ready to give you tradition right now. And then he goes on to give some of the earliest evidence we have for Jesus' resurrection, that Jesus died, he was buried, he was raised, and then he appeared to Peter, Paul, James, the 12, all the apostles, and more than 500. And so you're like, oh, wow, that's powerful. That's good. Well, it's nice to know that there's a creed there, but how do we date it and where did Paul get it? Well, Paul tells us in Galatians 1 that 3 years after his own conversion, he went to Jerusalem and inquired with Peter. The Greek word is hysteresis for inquired. So some people will say visit, some people will say met, but it's hysteresis, and it has the idea of getting to know and getting to know firsthand. So Paul's going down there with intentionality. And so scholars place this meeting where he's meeting Peter and James as the place where he received not just the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, but probably all the creeds that he learned. And so that's actually a quote from Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? I think it's page 131 because I was just looking it up the other day. But that's where scholars are widely agreed that Paul received this material. So that's pretty powerful evidence because it's from an eyewitness, received from other eyewitnesses, that's dated to the early 30s AD. And we can just make a couple other additional comments just for fun. But say Paul received it in Damascus instead of Jerusalem, right? Say he received that creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, what happened after he went to Damascus? He went somewhere 3 years later. He went to Jerusalem 3 years later. So all that content that he would have received in Damascus would have been confirmed in that meeting in 1 Corinthians, or in Galatians rather. And of course, in Galatians, the context is the gospel, and the context in 1 Corinthians 15 is the gospel. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 and 2, it says, this is the gospel that has the power to save, and it's of first importance. So he's talking about the gospel. So those are things he would have talked about. C.H. Dodd famously said, we can presume they did more than talk about the weather. And so it's just, those are really good points. Now, if Paul's receiving it there, though, it must have been developed prior to that. So it dates even earlier than those meetings. So we just say the early 30s because we can't pinpoint that down, but we just say the early 30s. And there's a number of different creeds in the New Testament. We just talked about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following, Romans 10:9, very famous one, right? They also go by names like confessions, homologia, charismatic statements, things like that. Romans 1, 3-4, Philippians 2, 5-11 are other ones. So there's a number of different creeds. If you can read Greek, it's easier to identify them. If you can't, a lot of the Bibles today are starting to bracket these creeds. Some are more questionable. We don't really know if it's a creed or not, but there are some it's quite evident that it is a creed, like 1 Corinthians 15. So those are good evidence for it being even earlier than just those late gospel datings if we use the late dating.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that kind of chain of custody there. That you laid out. That's really helpful. I love that. So I have two more questions. We're going to end with the minimal facts question. But before we get to that, and you can't answer this question with minimal facts. So I'm just giving you that ahead of time. Okay.
All right.
So you write, the subtitle is 13 arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. All right. So which of the 12, I'm removing the minimal facts just for now, do you find most persuasive personally?
Criteria. I think criteria. Because
okay.
Yeah. I think the criteria, it's hard because it depends on the different levels, but I think the criteria are good because we intuitively do it already. And a lot of times I don't know what this guy's saying, or maybe I don't know, but if I can verify someone else was there or whatever the case is, and I'm getting multiple reports on it. And then I'm saying, oh, look, here's some embarrassing testimony too. Oh, okay. All right. And then I can start applying those things. If I can do that to scripture, that's one of the embarrassing testimony is one of the biggest parts too of the criteria, because we find in scripture that all the flaws are laid bare. Someone put up the quote from 1984 the other day about how when certain groups get in power or when tyrants get in power, they whitewash history to make it look like everything they've done has always been perfect and is always perfect. We don't see anything like that in the New Testament. Peter's called Satan. I mean, it's just as it's like, man, like I could just, you guys couldn't have left that part out.
Yeah.
But so I mean, James was a skeptic during Jesus' life. John says even their brothers didn't believe him. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Paul was a persecutor of the church. Like, their flaws are there. So they're not interested in covering their flaws. They're interested in the truth because it's the truth of the gospel that is redeeming. There's forgiveness. And when you've been forgiven, it is very easy to, especially in this context of the gospel and God's grace, to confess, oh, yeah, this was wrong. And then that enables you to be more impartial as well. Anyway, there's some other elements there that are worth unpacking.
When you mentioned the criteria, I was thinking to myself, oh, what would be mine? And I thought, well, the textual evidence that there's such a volume of manuscripts and they're so early. But then I was thinking, well, if there were fewer and they were later, yet there was those criteria, I suppose that's the good thing about your book being like all these things working together is that when you have one upon the other, when you have so many manuscripts so early, and then you've got the external corroboration, then you've got, all these markers of authenticity and the things you mentioned, they just compound the reliability. Because if you just had one, well, yeah, you've got a lot of manuscripts, but you don't have any corroboration. Or you could say, oh, you've got corroboration, but it's so late and so few, but you've got all of these things together. One
of my goals is like, as people read this, different chapters are going to interest different people.
Yeah.
Like textual criticism is very hard. And I'm glad we have guys that love doing that because we need guys equipped in that area. And so I'm happy that they can go through those different manuscripts, that they like reading the handwritten. I got a hard time reading texts. So I'm just glad that there are guys, but we want people who are going to like, oh, God's equipped me such a way that I can produce value here. And so that's kind of what we're highlighting too in the chapters. There's different people skilled in those different aspects of reliability, and it's worth bringing them out. And so there's different parts of the body that all support one another. So it's kind of that dynamic going on in there.
And I love that idea of I've never thought of the historical criteria being intuitive. I really like that. I've never thought of how we can appeal when we're talking to people about how you do this all the time. And you can give the example of multiple testimonies or embarrassing testimony or, earlier to the event that had happened and all of those things. Like most people aren't going to push back on that. I've never thought of approaching it like that.
I'll give you a quick story on that. It's worth noting. Look, Lacona has a great article because there are some scholars in New Testament that push back on the criteria a little bit. And Kevin Burr, by the way, has an excellent book on the subject. I recommend that. But also Lacona's article, Is the Sky Falling in New Testament Research, I believe is the title. And he starts going, he starts questioning these guys who are pushing back on the criteria. Now, the criteria aren't like, it's not a calculator. It takes some judgment and wisdom in the application of them. But some were questioning, maybe we should get rid of all these criteria and use something else. And Lacona's like, really? This is what we're going to do then, huh? I'm just curious. I know you guys affirm Jesus' crucifixion. How do you know it happened? Are you guys just taking it by I don't want to say blind faith, but just by pure faith then? You're just taking it for what it says? And you're not doing historical work? Because that was what they were saying. The criteria weren't historical work. So he's like, well, how do you know that Jesus' resurrection happened? Because I think he's talking to certain stripes of academia as well. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting because if you get rid of them, well, then how do you know the past? What are some of the tools you use? And so Kevin Burr's book's great because he also challenges those same group, and he highlights how they actually use the criteria in their own works, even if they call it a different name.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last question I had for you is you're obviously a proponent of the minimal facts approach, as is Dr. Habermas. And there's been a bit of, I don't know what the word, hubbub, if you want, controversy, if you will.
In hockey, you say there's a scuffle.
Yes, a scuffle. Yes, indeed. There's a scuffle about whether or not to use what is the minimal facts approach, which Brian characterized earlier. You're using those facts that are highly evidenced, and then also that the majority of even critics would concede. And then what's called the maximal approach, which is where you kind of argue for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts. And then you use all of that data to argue for the resurrection. And in your book, I noticed that you kind of don't, I don't know if you did this intentionally or not, but it seemed like you were trying to kind of thread a needle between the two and say that one could lead to the other. And so I don't know if I've characterized that correctly, but can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a chapter in there on undesigned coincidences, and I use the minimal facts too. So I like both. It's a jujitsu move. Like I want to know as many moves as I can because I don't know what the context of the situation will allow me to discuss. So I like, there's nothing wrong with both approaches. It's great to have multiple tools in your toolbox that you can use. What happens too, I think, in the reliability approach is, so like you got the 13. So say someone read the 13 books and, or the 13 arguments. And like, okay, this is good. I believe they're reliable. Now show me how Jesus rose from the dead. What do I need to know that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, if I'm going to do that, I have to start somewhere, and I'm going to start with Jesus' death. Then I'm going to maybe try to show that he was buried, that people had experiences of the risen Jesus. And as I'm starting to do this, the facts I start with look a lot like the minimal facts that we start with too. So there's it's like a Venn diagram where you can start there. You're starting on the same facts because the resurrection involves those facts. You can't, if we're going to talk about the resurrection, we got to deal with those facts. So I think either way, you end up at those points. So it just kind of depends on the person. But typically the minimal facts, because I'm just starting on those facts, I can just unpack them without having to get into reliability issues. And sometimes people just want to go down discussions that aren't relevant to resurrection. Like, do we want to spend, an hour or 20 minutes or whatever? Did Mark write his gospel in the 40s AD or 65 AD? Oh, okay, sure. Did Mark say Jesus died? Yeah, okay. Did we have other attests? So we can combine that to the argument, but what's going to help us on Jesus' death and resurrection? So I like staying on those facts because they are the relevant ones. Because if Jesus died and rose from the again, like this is why the minimal facts is at the end. Because even if my first 12 chapters are total bunk and garbage, well, you still got Jesus rising from the dead. And we have some, based upon the most reliable data. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I do like that. And I do say this in my dissertation chapter, my middle chapter is on the minimal facts approach and criteria. It kind of highlights how do we know the past. And I use the minimal facts as a good place to start. It's not the finish line, it's the starting line. So if you think it's the finish line, I think there's been a misstep somewhere. So you can keep going from there.
Okay, good. That's helpful. And hey, I wanted to say, you mentioned your chapter on undesigned coincidences. I've never been particularly moved by those as an argument. Reading your chapter in the way that you explained it, it was the first time that I really was impressed with those. And so I just wanted to commend you. I thought you did an excellent job representing those and kind of unlocking those for me. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I probably had a ghostwriter for that chapter.
Well, can you thank your ghostwriter then, please? Ghostwriter, if you're listening, that was for you.
Well, Benjamin Shaw, it's been a fascinating conversation. Appreciate your time. And you're in the library and they're kicking you out. I'd see that there's like guards coming in now. Man. So thank you so much.
What a stereotypical academic position to be in. I'm in the library and they're kicking me out. Yeah, that's why I got to talk about the jujitsu and the hockey more, so I don't sound like such a dork.
Oh, man. Well, watch out for that symmetrical book stacking. But
right. That's right.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate you guys having me. It was a lot of fun doing this.
Well, great. We'll point people to your resources online. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.